Have you ever found yourself looking at an old, iconic photograph? One of those images that captured a moment of pure fairy tale glamour? Your eye is naturally drawn to the center of the frame, to the celebrity or the royal figure at the heart of the spectacle. We know their story, or at least we think we do. But if you allow your gaze to drift to the edges of the photograph, you'll see other faces, people standing in the orbit of that fame. They are the attendants, the close friends, the silent witnesses to history, their own stories rarely, if ever, told. Today we're going to focus on one such woman, a figure of extraordinary beauty and poise, captured forever in the periphery of a legendary celebration. In the images, she stands as a bridesmaid, a position that signifies not just an invitation, but an intimate bond of trust and affection. She appears perfectly at ease, the absolute epitome of grace and sophistication, a woman whose future seems just as bright and secure as the famous bride beside her. But a photograph, for all its power, only freezes a single fleeting second. It cannot tell you what happens next, how history can be a fickle storyteller, or how two lives standing side by side in one moment can be sent down wildly divergent paths. This is the incredible and ultimately heartbreaking story of Carolyn Scott Reybold. It's a haunting reminder that the most polished facades can hide the deepest cracks, and that behind the most beautiful smiles, the human mind can be fighting a battle that no one else can see. To truly understand Carolyn's ascent, we must first immerse ourselves in the world that created her. The America of the late 1940s and 1950s was a nation brimming with a potent, almost dizzying sense of optimism. Emerging from the shadows of a world war, the country was flexing its economic muscle. A new consumer culture was taking root, fueled by television, advertising, and the promise of the American dream. Suburbia was blooming, families were growing, and an idealized image of American life was being broadcast into every home. At the heart of this ideal was a very specific vision of womanhood. The perfect woman was a gracious hostess, a devoted wife, a nurturing mother, the serene queen of her domestic castle. Yet simmering just beneath this placid surface was a countercurrent of ambition and change. For a select few, especially in cosmopolitan hubs like New York City, new avenues were opening up. A woman could be more than a homemaker. She could be a pioneer, an artist, a professional. And one of the most visible and glamorous of these new professions was modeling. The fashion industry of this era was a universe unto itself. It wasn't the globally saturated, influencer-driven world we know today. It was a more exclusive, carefully curated domain dictated by a handful of powerful photographers, magazine editors, and agency heads. And among the most powerful was Eileen Ford. The Ford Modeling Agency, which she co-founded with her husband Jerry in 1946, wasn't just a business. It was a finishing school for a new kind of American beauty. Eileen Ford was a formidable figure, a notoriously strict matriarch who demanded punctuality, professionalism, and unimpeachable conduct from her girls. She housed them in her own home, vetted their dates, and dictated their diets. In return, she transformed them into stars. Ford models weren't just anonymous clothes hangers, they were personalities. They had a look, healthy, elegant, sophisticated, and quintessentially American. They were the faces that sold lipstick, automobiles, and the very idea of a perfect life. It was into this demanding yet dazzling world that Carolyn Scott stepped. Possessing a natural aristocratic beauty and a quiet poise, she was a perfect fit for the Ford aesthetic. She quickly became one of the agency's most sought-after models. Her face graced the covers of prominent magazines like Vogue and Harper's Bazaar, and she was a favorite for high-end advertising campaigns. Her life was a whirlwind of photo shoots, fashion shows, and fittings with legendary designers. She moved within the highest echelons of New York society, a world of debutante balls at the Plaza, charity galas at the Waldorf Astoria, and exclusive parties where she mingled with artists, financiers, and celebrities. She wasn't just playing a part for the camera, she was living the life that millions of women read about in glossy magazines. Her success was a testament not only to her beauty, but to her discipline and ability to navigate this competitive, high-stakes environment. She was, by all accounts, on top of the world. The most luminous thread in the tapestry of Carolyn's glamorous life was her deep and genuine friendship with Grace Kelly. Their connection wasn't a product of public relations or a fleeting society acquaintance. It was a bond forged away from the cameras, built on shared experiences and mutual affection. They met at a time when both were young women on the cusp of extraordinary fame. Grace was a rising star in Hollywood, already gaining acclaim for her talent and her cool ice princess beauty. Carolyn was a reigning queen of the New York modeling scene. They moved in similar social circles and were introduced, and an immediate kinship developed. They were both women who understood the pressures of living a life in the public eye, of having their appearance constantly scrutinized. They found in each other a confidant, someone who understood the unique challenges of their world. Their friendship blossomed through shared moments, both grand and simple. They would have lunch at popular Manhattan restaurants, go on shopping trips, and share quiet dinners discussing their hopes, fears, and careers. Nina Giles, Carolyn's daughter, would later recount stories her mother told of these times, of Grace's quiet sense of humor, her loyalty, and her surprising down-to-earth nature despite her growing stardom. It was a friendship of equals, two intelligent and ambitious women navigating the exhilarating but often treacherous waters of fame. When Grace Kelly's whirlwind romance with Prince Rainier III of Monaco became public, the world was enchanted. It was a real-life fairy tale. And when the time came to plan the wedding, an event that would be watched by an estimated 30 million people around the globe, Grace turned to her closest friends to stand by her side. Carolyn Scott was one of the 6 women she chose to be her bridesmaids. This was no small honor. It was a public declaration of their deep bond. Carolyn was flown to Monaco, a jewel box of a principality on the French Riviera, to take part in the week-long festivities. The wedding itself was an affair of breathtaking scale. There was a civil ceremony followed by a lavish religious ceremony at the St. Nicholas Cathedral. The bride's dress, a gift from MGM Studios, was a masterpiece of silk taffeta, antique lace, and seed pearls, crafted by the legendary costume designer Helen Rose. Carolyn and the other bridesmaids wore elegant yellow organza gowns, designed by the same atelier. Her role was to support her friend on the most important day of her life, to adjust her train, to offer a reassuring smile amidst the overwhelming crush of media and protocol. For Carolyn, it was the zenith of her social life, a moment of reflected glory that placed her at the very center of a global spectacle. One rarely told anecdote from this time, later shared by her daughter, reveals the quiet intimacy that persisted even amidst the pomp. The night before the religious ceremony, Grace, feeling the immense weight of the moment, sought out Carolyn for a private conversation. Away from the family and the officials, she confessed her nerves and her fears about the enormous life change ahead. Carolyn, ever the calm and steady friend, simply listened, offering not grand advice, but the quiet, unwavering support that had defined their relationship. It was a small, human moment, a pocket of stillness in the eye of a historical hurricane. In the photographs of the wedding, Carolyn looks radiant, a perfect embodiment of the grace and optimism of the era. but no camera could capture the turn her life was about to take. Shortly after the fairy tale wedding in Monaco, Carolyn's own life took a decisive turn. She married Malcolm Reybold, a dashing advertising executive who moved in the same sophisticated circles. In line with the prevailing social customs of the time for women of her class, her marriage marked the end of her professional modeling career. It was an expected transition, a graceful exit from the public stage into the private sphere of domestic life. The couple, along with their growing family, moved out of the vibrant heart of Manhattan to a sprawling, impressive home in the affluent suburbs of Long Island. On the surface, it was the next logical step in a charmed life, a beautiful house, a successful husband, and children. It was the American dream, fully realized. However, the idyllic facade masked a slow, insidious change. The move to Long Island proved to be deeply isolating for Carolyn. The house, while grand, was secluded. The spontaneous social life of the city was replaced by a more structured, suburban existence that she found stifling. The constant energy, the professional validation, the camaraderie of her peers, all the things that had animated her life were gone. According to her daughter Nina Giles, the transformation was profound and deeply unsettling. The effervescent, confident, and highly social woman began to recede, replaced by someone her family barely recognized. Carolyn grew increasingly withdrawn, her vibrant personality dimming like a fading light. She, who had once been the life of the party, now avoided social gatherings. She became quiet, distant, and exhibited behaviors that her family found confusing and alarming. This was the beginning of a long and tragic descent into the grips of a severe, undiagnosed mental illness. We must remember the context of the times. In the 1960s and 70s, the understanding of mental health was still in its infancy. There was a profound stigma attached to any form of psychological struggle. Conditions like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or severe depression were poorly understood by the general public and even by many in the medical community. They were often seen as character flaws, moral failings, or simply bad nerves. The language to describe these conditions was limited, and the treatments could be crude and ineffective. Families often dealt with such issues in secret, overcome with shame and confusion. Carolyn's illness manifested in ways that slowly dismantled her life piece by piece. Her behavior became more erratic. She was plagued by paranoia, convinced that people were watching her or plotting against her. Her moods would swing dramatically, from periods of deep withdrawn depression to moments of agitated anxiety. For her children, growing up in this environment was a bewildering experience. They knew the mother they loved was still in there somewhere, but she was trapped behind a wall of illness they couldn't penetrate. Nina Giles has spoken of the profound sense of loss and fear that permeated their home, the feeling of walking on eggshells, never knowing which version of their mother they would encounter. Her illness strained her marriage to its breaking point. Her husband, likely overwhelmed and ill-equipped to handle the severity of her condition, struggled to cope. The social connections that had once defined her life withered away. Friends stopped calling, unable to understand or deal with her unpredictable behavior. Even her once unbreakable bond with Princess Grace faded. The geographical distance was a factor, as were Grace's own immense responsibilities as the ruler of a principality. But the primary barrier was Carolyn's illness, which made consistent, healthy communication nearly impossible. A heartbreaking detail shared by Nina involves her mother meticulously composing long, rambling letters to Grace, letters that were often incoherent and reflected the fractured state of her mind. It's unclear how many of these letters were ever sent, or if Grace was ever fully aware of the depth of her friend's tragic decline. As the years went on, Carolyn's world shrank until it consisted of little more than the confines of her own troubled mind. Her mental state led to a series of poor financial decisions and an inability to manage her affairs. The family's fortune dwindled. The beautiful home on Long Island was lost. The marriage eventually dissolved. Carolyn, the woman who had once graced the pages of Vogue and stood beside a princess, was left adrift, with no safety net to catch her. Her story became a freefall, a slow-motion collapse that played out over decades, largely invisible to the outside world that had once celebrated her. She lost her friends, her fortune, her home, and ultimately, her family, who were simply unable to provide the level of specialized care she so desperately needed but could never properly receive. In the narrative of a beautiful woman's tragic downfall, society often seeks a simple, dramatic explanation. Rumors and whispers fill the void left by facts. In Carolyn's case, a particularly persistent and entirely false rumor took hold in some circles. It was a convoluted story suggesting that Carolyn had been part of a politically motivated marriage swap. This theory claimed she was originally intended to marry Michael Canfield, the first husband of Lee Radziwill, Jacqueline Kennedy's sister. The rumor posited that for political reasons, the brides were switched, and Carolyn's life was somehow sacrificed for the ambitions of the Kennedy clan. This piece of gossip provided a neat, almost cinematic explanation for her decline. She was a pawn in a game of power, a victim of a great love denied. It was dramatic, intriguing, and utterly untrue. Her daughter Nina Giles has been unequivocal in debunking this myth. The real story, as she makes clear, is far more tragic and far less glamorous. There was no political conspiracy, no secret plot. The cause of her mother's ruin was not an external force, but an internal one. The devastating, insidious progression of an untreated mental illness. The real controversy, if one could call it that, is not about a fabricated love triangle, but about the historical and societal failure to understand and address mental health. The debate lies in our collective discomfort with stories like Carolyn's. We prefer our tragedies to have clear villains and identifiable turning points. It is far more unsettling to accept that a person can have every advantage in life, beauty, wealth, social standing, and still be completely undone by the mysterious workings of their own brain. Carolyn's story forces us to confront the limitations of the past, to look at an era we often romanticize and see its deep-seated ignorance regarding psychological suffering. It raises uncomfortable questions about the responsibility of family and friends when faced with a loved one's mental illness, especially in an era when effective help was virtually non-existent. Another point of quiet debate revolves around her friendship with Princess Grace. Was Carolyn abandoned by her famous friend? From the outside, it might be easy to pass judgment. However, the reality was infinitely more complex. By the time Carolyn's illness was at its most severe, the two women were living in different worlds in every sense. Grace was on another continent, bound by the immense duties and strict protocols of her royal role. Her life was not her own. Furthermore, maintaining a relationship with someone suffering from severe paranoia and delusion is an incredibly difficult, sometimes impossible, task. Communication breaks down, trust erodes, and the shared reality that forms the basis of a friendship dissolves. The fading of their bond was likely not a callous act of abandonment on Grace's part, but a tragic consequence of illness and circumstance, a slow, painful drifting apart that likely caused sadness on both sides. It's another layer to the tragedy. The illness not only took Carolyn's mind, but it also severed the connections that might have been a source of comfort. The ultimate and most shocking consequence of Carolyn's long struggle was her descent into homelessness. In the final years of her life, this woman who had once modeled couture gowns and attended royal weddings found herself destitute. She had lost everything. Her journey ended in a place that could not have been more different from her beginnings, a women's shelter. It is a detail so stark, so devastating, that it forces a complete reevaluation of her life story. The glamour and the fame of her youth become not just a distant memory, but a cruel counterpoint to the harsh reality of her end. She became one of the thousands of anonymous faces in a city, a person shuffled through a system designed for the forgotten. The historical significance of Carolyn Scott Reybold's life, however, does not end in that shelter. It was resurrected and given profound meaning by her daughter. Nina Giles's book, The Bridesmaid's Daughter, From Grace Kelly's Wedding to a Women's Shelter, is a monumental act of love, reclamation, and historical testimony. In writing the book, Nina did more than just recount her mother's biography. She embarked on a quest for understanding. She sought to piece together the puzzle of her mother's life, to look beyond the illness and find the vibrant woman she once was. The book is a powerful social document, offering a raw, intimate look at the devastating impact of mental illness on a family in a time before understanding and compassion were common. It sheds light on a dark corner of our recent past, reminding us of the immense progress we have made in mental health awareness and how far we still have to go. Carolyn's story, as told through her daughter's eyes, becomes a powerful cautionary tale. It dismantles the myth of the perfect life and reveals the profound fragility that underlies all human existence. It teaches us that wealth and status are no shield against the deepest forms of human suffering. Her life serves as a poignant illustration of why mental health care is so vital and what can happen when it is absent. More than anything, her story is a powerful argument for empathy. It compels us to look at those who are struggling, those who have been marginalized or forgotten, and to wonder about the stories they carry, the lives they lived before their fall, the potential they held, and the dignity they deserve. Carolyn Scott Reybold's legacy, therefore, is not one of a failed model or a tragic footnote in a royal story. It is a legacy of survival, of a story that refused to remain silent, and of a daughter's fierce determination to give her mother back her name and her humanity. So let us picture two women. The first is standing in the brilliant Mediterranean sunlight of Monaco, dressed in yellow organza, her smile serene as she watches her friend, a Hollywood star, become a real-life princess. The future stretches before her, a seemingly endless vista of privilege and happiness. The second woman is standing under the harsh fluorescent lights of a New York City shelter, clutching a small bag of belongings, her face etched with a confusion and sadness that no one around her understands. The devastating truth, the one that should stop us all in our tracks, is that they are the same woman. Now go back to that original photograph from 1956. Look at the radiant bride, and then let your eyes drift to the bridesmaid standing beside her. We can no longer see a simple, smiling face. We now see a ghost from the future, a heartbreaking before in a story of unimaginable loss. The photograph is no longer a fairy tale. It is a profound lesson in humility. It reminds us with chilling power that we never truly know the private battles being fought behind a public smile. In the end, Carolyn Scott Reybold's story is not about royalty or fashion or the glamour of a bygone era. It is a story about the treacherous, uncharted territory of the human mind. It is about the devastating power of illness to erase a life and the redemptive power of a daughter's love to write it back into history. It is a call for compassion, a plea to look for the person behind the illness, and a timeless reminder that every face at the edge of the photograph holds a story as deep, as complex, and as worthy of being told as the one in the center.